Thank you so much, Arundhathi Akka, for joining with us tonight. So with that, to start off directly into the conversation, I hand over the mic to Partha.
Thank you, Pawan, and thank you, Arundhati ji, for joining us here today. Having read your book, More Than a Life, several times, it is very striking that you'd been in a really rare position to witness a master from a very close proximity and to make this available for several through your book. So, could you please begin by sharing a little about this experience?
So, Partha, is the question really about the making of the book specifically? Is that what you'd like me to talk about?
Yes.
Yes. So, first, I just want to say thank you. I'm very glad to be here and having a conversation around a book that is now almost a decade old. And when I look back on it, sometimes it startles me when I realize that it's actually over 11, almost 11 years since it was published. So in some ways, it seems a very long time ago, and in other ways, not at all. Since you've asked specifically about the journey of the book, I will say that it actually had its beginning somewhere around 2006, when I was on a walk with Sadhguru around the ashram in Coimbatore, and I was talking to him about books, because that's what we discussed a lot of the time. And I told him that while it was wonderful that there were so many books already that incorporated the question answer format in which we could hear his voice very strongly as a guru, I felt that there was really nothing about his own extraordinary life and that journey. So I said there needs to be something, and he very casually, as is his manner, said, "Why don't you do it?" And of course I agreed at that time with a certain casualness that, looking back at, I actually think was a bit foolhardy, because nothing really prepared me for the journey itself. And it turned out to be 4 long years of it was a mixed journey. There was excitement, there was the sheer joy of conversation and reading transcripts that I was delving out of the Isha archives. There were conversations with many around him, those who'd known him in the 90s and before that. Conversations happened which were enriching with him and with those who knew him. But there was also the whole roller coaster journey of making a book like this. I think one perhaps jumps into it with a certain exuberance and then becomes chastened somewhere along the way. And that's what happened with me. I was excited until I found I actually had to find a way to transcribe all that material and put it on the printed page. And perhaps my greatest challenge, Partha, was finding a tone for that book, because I knew I wanted a tone that reflected the sense of wonder that I felt at having discovered Sadhguru, the sense of wonder, the sense of excitement, also the respect that I felt. But at the same time, I wanted the book to have a spirit of inquiry. I wanted it to reflect the questions that I had and sometimes continue to have. I did not want it to be a hagiography. I did not want it to be a book that presented Sadhguru as some kind of plaster saint that deified him in a particular way. I did not want that. So I wanted a certain complexity of tone, and I think eventually, just when I kind of given up on the book, I remember receiving this email from Sadhguru saying, "Is this going to be a posthumous biography?" And that made me sit down and start over.
Right.
And actually, from 6 months after that email, the book was ready. So it happened with great speed after that. There was a way in which I felt the tone was falling into place. And Penguin immediately showed an interest in the book, and the book happened. So there was a certain serendipity to it, I think, eventually. But it was not an easy journey. It was a roller coaster journey.
Would you like to probably comment on the difficulty or how the roller coaster ride was briefly, Akka?
I think the roller coaster was precisely this: finding on the one hand a tone and aligning myself with that tone. I did not want to sound like a particular kind of. Let me say this: there are 2 ways in which you can approach a book of this kind. as an insider or as an outsider. Now, I wanted a book of this kind to be one that spoke to the insider, but I also wanted it to be invitational to the outsider. So I had to position myself somewhere between being a critical insider and a sympathetic outsider. That's somewhere where I had to position myself. And it was not, eventually I realized it was actually where I was, because it was a journey through which I saw Sadhguru increasingly as my own guru. That was certainly happening. But my own journey of as a seeker had preceded that. I'd say there were 3 phases of my journey even before I met Sadhguru. Earlier, there was the phase of unconscious seeking, then there was a phase of conscious seeking, and once Sadhguru came into my life in the terms of and Isha and the practices, it became a phase of I would probably be a kind of committed seeker. I think that's how I would see myself even today, which doesn't mean my questions have stopped. My questions are still very alive. My questions are still very much there. So when I decided that I would acknowledge those questions, and at the same time I would acknowledge the sense of wonder, I realized both these could go hand in hand, and there was no essential contradiction between the two. Sometimes we believe that we need to turn into, that becoming a disciple means becoming a cabbage, which it doesn't. And equally, we sometimes believe that standing apart from something is the only way to be skeptical, and I don't think that's true either. I think the path of a kind of dynamic commitment, a growing, evolving commitment, which has its share of doubts, which has its share of questions, and still continues. That for me is the kind of journey that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yes, most certainly, and we will delve into a lot more aspects of that response. And you spoke about how there was a journey much before Sadhguru, right?
Yes.
And in the book, in the introduction, you also speak of a certain phase in the year 1997. You mentioned about a shift in your life in 1997, where you mentioned about knowing you were dying, if precisely that's the word. In many ways, this has been the work of many spiritual gurus to bring this awareness, for our own mortality. Would you say that 1997 was perhaps the beginning of something totally different?
It's a good question. Yes, I do think it was a turning point. I could probably, I see that as one of the most pivotal experiences of my life. Until then, I had been a seeker, but as I said, perhaps an unconscious seeker. I believed that I had questions. I had questions about living and dying and loss and impermanence. I felt very deeply drawn, as so many have, to the story of the Buddha, that whole story of the unlicensed seeker, if you will. And that had been an integral part of my life, but it felt like these questions weren't necessarily the questions that were being asked in philosophy departments. Though I did toy with the idea of taking up philosophy, it felt like the desperation and urgency was not of these questions the way I had them, wasn't quite the way in which they were being articulated there. But what I did find was literature, and literature has been a part of my life forever, but it also, I realized, seemed to be the only place, and I would say this is true of it even today, it is the only place where I seemed to be able to express wonder, where I could express wonder and not merely express conclusions. It felt like everywhere else people were reaching for certainties of some kind or the other, or emphatic opinions of one kind or the other. Literature seemed to be one place where you could be many things all at once. You could have a complex position of loving something and arguing with it at the same time, as the Bhakti poets do. We'll come back to the Bhakti poets later. But I realized literature was a place where complex positions could be taken and complex questions could be asked. So that seemed to be quite enough for me until 1997, when a certain experience began for which I had no ready explanation. I was returning from Nepal, I think. It was a holiday in Nepal. I then spent a week in Delhi, and I was returning on my own on the train. It was the Rajdhani from Delhi to Bombay. And I happened to be reading the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, a magnificent book by Sogyal Rinpoche, so I'd like to mention it to those who haven't heard of it. It's a book to pick up and a book to own. I was reading that book, and I don't know whether it had something to do with the book, whether it had something to do with a germ that I picked up in Nepal,
Right.
whether it had to do with a passing lama who infected me with something, or the fact that I was at the Padmanabhaswamy, at the Pashupatinath temple. I don't know what it was. But what I
Right.
do know is that something began to change. And it was not, I was not physically unwell. I was, in fact, particularly well. I'd had a happy holiday and I was well. I was not psychologically disturbed. I've had my share of the blues, as I say, and I know that this was not melancholy of any kind. It was not despair of any kind. What was happening to me as I experienced it was a sense of physical ebbing away. I was dying. But the thing is that there was no loss of energy with it. What I was experiencing was a heightened sense of aliveness along with the physical process of dying. So the two went hand in hand, and I didn't know what was happening. It just felt like the entire world was turning shadowy. People around me were shadowy. My pets were shadowy, which was also quite a revelation. I thought that was not possible. I was very deeply attached to my cats. And it really seemed like there was nothing to hold on to. And I would go to bed every night hoping that the next day would be different, but I would wake up feeling exactly the same way. Now, this experience lasted perhaps a week or a little more, but it was so intense that when I emerged from it, I emerged, for one, deeply grateful to be back in the daytime world that I had known until then. But I also emerged with the conviction that I needed in some way to find a way to make my peace with this experience, because I knew this was real, and I also knew it was, of course, inevitable, that at some point I would have to experience this again, maybe at the time when I left my body. But I needed in some way to make my peace with it. So I think that's when I became what I would call a conscious seeker, willing to swallow some of my pride and look for answers in places where I perhaps wouldn't have looked for them earlier. I read books of all kinds, I attended courses, programs, everything. Things that I might not customarily have done before that. And the most significant shift that happened, Partha, was the fact that I was no longer reading just philosophy, I was reading the mystics. Because it felt now that the mystics were the only ones who talked of this journey of dying in the way that made sense to me. I turned to St. John of the Cross with his marvelous canticles and his wonderful and deeply evocative poems about the dark night of the soul. And I turned to Ramana Maharishi, who actually speaks of an experience of dying that happened inexplicably to him in his teens. The difference, of course, was that Ramana went all the way through and emerged enlightened, whereas I seemed to have entered one part of one portal and not quite made my way entirely to the end of it. But in some way, these accounts resonated. They offered some consolation. And then in 2004, when I happened to stumble into this talk by Sadhguru, the first thing that struck me as I listened to him, and I remember this was at the KC College Auditorium in South Mumbai, as I listened to him, I remember thinking, this is possibly the kind of person who could address an experience of this kind. And he would address it in the way that that would make sense to me, that would resonate with me. Because, of course, he was all the things that we all have known him to be, which is accessible, pragmatic, down to earth, real, funny, irreverent, which was very important to me. Most important was the fact that he was not sanctimonious. He was not holier than thou, which was something I would not have been able to stand, and I would not have been able to. I would not have been drawn to. But it felt like this was someone who was had clarity, had aliveness, and had competence. I think that was the combination that drew me. And of course, a conversation began then that has deepened since, and programs followed, and practices followed, which have also deepened. And that's how I became, I think, what I would call a committed seeker.
Great. That's fascinating, Arundhati ji. There are a couple of things I mean that really struck me. One thing is definitely two things that you wanted to stand out with your book were a sense of wonder, but also to have to keep the skepticism alive in the book. And I think while I kept running into the wonder, the first time I read the book, it felt a little almost annoying, if you'll allow me to say that, to run into the skepticism suddenly. It was almost like a speed breaker to, give you a pause. But you just mentioned spiritual practices as well. I thought I'll kind of jump to that because I found that very interesting. A spiritual practice can be, extremely beneficial to a seeker, and different masters at different points of time have given, different practices. What was your experience like taking up spiritual practices? Uh, did you take to them really easily? How was it for you?
I think I was certainly seeking a practice that allowed me to be with myself. Uh, Writing had come close, but writing was still verbal. And I'd realized by the time, by 97 and after, that I needed a non-verbal practice and a daily practice. And I tried various practices, some of which helped me enormously. But when I began the Isha practices, particularly the Kriya, it felt like a way of inhabiting myself in a way that is that I emerged from daily feeling energized, feeling lighter, feeling more myself. And I think that was something that drew me to it. And it's one of the reasons that sustained me. It's one of the reasons why it is still part of my life. I also found Shunya a particularly valuable gift because it allowed me to. I think it was Pavan who read an excerpt from the book and who talked of the part where I talk about feeling like a trapezium and feeling like fraught and fissured inside. And I felt that Shunya actually allowed me to inhabit myself in a way where my innards actually felt harmonious and felt habitable and felt invitational. So it was a very great gift. So I can't, all I can say is I'm not the kind of person who would be drawn to regimentation of any kind. I'm not good at boot camps. I would have run away if it was presented as some kind of, if this had been an imposition, that I had seen this as an imposition. But I think what helped enormously was the fact that the practices just felt like a wonderful, natural, easy way to be with oneself, a key to oneself. And I can't, I'm deeply grateful for those practices. I don't do them as a matter of guilt anymore. It's not penance, it's not virtue that makes me turn to those practices. It's just the fact that they're pleasurable.
Right. That brings me on to what you just said, Akka, about how you weren't the kind who would accept things very in the conventional way, and that I think has resonated in your book quite a few times about the role of skepticism throughout the spiritual journey. Would you like to say something more about that?
Well, I'm curious about what Partha said, because Partha just said he was actually annoyed at the skepticism. There are others who are actually annoyed at the bhakti, or not annoyed, but who are actually who may actually stop short at the wonder. Did you say, Partha, that you were actually you found yourself at the first reading stopping short at the skepticism and feeling that you wanted more bhakti? Well, it's interesting. So here, let me respond to this. I've never seen. For me, skepticism, being a skeptic, as in someone who asks questions, has never been at variance with respect. Never. The two can go together, and in fact, I believe they must go together, ideally. One can feel the more connected or the more interested you are in something, the more you want, the more attentiveness with which you approach it, the questions will increase. And in this, I'm going to come back to More Than a Life, but I actually want to take a little detour, not a detour, but something that actually illustrates this for me. And it is the book of Bhakti poetry that I embarked on and which was published in 2015, I think. It was called Eating God. And it's very deeply linked to this because Bhakti, the way I understand it, and what I realized from the a wonderful legacy of Bhakti poets that we have, I realized that Bhakti is absolutely not blind faith. It has never been. What I loved about the Bhakti poets, the finest of them, is that they are capable of arguing with their gods, quarreling with their gods, shaking a fist at their gods, doubting their gods, but they are honest about every one of these emotional states. Absolutely honest and absolutely vulnerable in their articulation of these states, because these are the states that every seeker passes through. So, in that, I realized that it was almost a reaffirmation for me of what I had experienced in a small way in my journey, which is that it is possible to disagree and love at the same time. That disagreement is not a sign of disloyalty at all. At all. And I wanted the texture of that to be part of this book, simply because that has been part of the texture of my relationship with Sadhguru. It's also been, there's been this tremendous sense of wonder, and there's also been questions. Both have always gone hand in hand.
Akka, at that point, may I also
Yes.
ask you to just read an excerpt that I feel might fit into our conversation right now. If you have the book, it's on page 205. Uh, Time to Grace the Valleys of Life, and the first paragraph of that chapter.
I see. I'm sorry. Is it page 205?
Yeah.
Okay. I see. The first paragraph. You want me to read that?
Yes, if you could please.
Of course. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of my interaction with Sadhguru has been the chance to watch him segue on a moment-to-moment basis between the individual and the archetype, between man and guru. In our arguments, I've often believed he's contradictory. But on another level, it's those very contradictions that I find baffling and intriguing all at once. Did you want the second paragraph?
Yes, if you would like to.
Yes, please.
Well, maybe
That's
just
actually
the
a
lines.
favorite. Yeah.
There's his ability. I see. Okay. There's his ability in the middle of an intense discussion to suddenly stop and draw my attention to the limpid quality of sunlight, or to the trajectory of a feather falling through the clear afternoon air. We were talking about his past lives once, when he suddenly paused mid-sentence to point out the presence of an owl half concealed on the tree in his garden. I was on a long walk with him when he talked about Nirvikalpa Samadhi, cracked a risque joke, drew my attention to the changing colors of the clouds, and had an animated exchange with a tribal woman about the nature of her work, all in the course of a few minutes. On another occasion, we were in his car having an argument when he informed me, casually mid-sentence, that there were 2 snakes in the rear of the car. My capacity for argument turned suddenly feeble. That has happened on several occasions, I think, and not just because there are snakes.
Right.
Yeah.
So you was.
Yeah, the thing that really struck me about these few paragraphs, Arundhati, that just before I'd read this book of yours, I'd actually read the small book, I don't remember the name anymore, by Idris Shah. And several of the things, especially the contradictory aspects that you mentioned in your book, were, they stood out very clearly in his book as well. So in an odd way,
probably about the Sufi saints, right?
Correct.
I mean, that's right.
Yeah.
And I think this has certainly been true of many of the mystics that we read about in the sacred literature from all over the world. This, ability to embody contradictions effortlessly, and all of which, as you watch, sort of seems to add up to this great celebration of life itself. So you realize it's not about a position or an attitude or an opinion. What they're actually offering you is a taste of life itself, and that is really why I think so many of us feel the sense of heightened aliveness, and people seem to have felt it in the presence of some of the greatest mystics down the ages.
Yeah, and if I can, I just wanted to point out one thing Idris Shah said, which I found in your book as well. When I would listen to Sadhguru, like Sadhguru emphasizes a lot about the I don't know. One of the things I ran into quite often is that I've never heard Sadhguru say I don't know, so how does this add up? And Idris Shah points out that saying the mystic will probably say I don't know when it actually has a deeper meaning and more significance.
Well, I also would, that's a beautiful line. And I would also say that if you remember in the book, I haven't read More Than a Life in a very long time, not since I wrote it. But one of the things I do remember him saying, which I think I put into the book, is he talks of enlightenment, Sadhguru as well talks of enlightenment as borderless ignorance. So he's actually saying, I don't know, on another level altogether, which again ties up with what you point out from your Idris reading, doesn't it?
Yes, definitely.
Yes, so we often think of enlightenment as a state of all knowing, but here is someone who speaks of it as borderless ignorance. For me, that image has stayed very deeply.
Thank you. That was very, very insightful.
Also, at that point, it brings me to another question. By the time that you started writing More Than a Life, you had Sadhguru was already your guru. Did you have to play the role of a writer any different than that of being, seeing Sadhguru as a guru?
I think perhaps not, Pavan, because I feel that, as I said earlier, I settled down into this book only when I realized that I needed a tone that was true to me. And the rest of it, of course, was allowing the story to unfold. And it is an extraordinary story. So allowing that to unfold and to not pretend to be an omniscient narrator. I think that was important, that I couldn't pretend that I know that this is the truth and here is the truth. I was not presenting a verified catalogue of events. I knew that was not the case. I was really basing it on conversations and on my own inner experience. And I wanted the authenticity of that in some way to come through. You can in a book only be what you are. So yes, I was a listener. For most of the book, I was a listener. And at times when I felt there would be questions that the reader might actually have and share with me, I would ask those questions and I would try and make sure that that was also carried through in the book. But other than that, no. I think it was pretty reflective of who I was, which is someone who doesn't see, as I said earlier, bhakti and questioning as mutually incompatible. I see them as going together. And once I was able to acknowledge that, I think that became part of the book.
That's so fantastic.
So, Arundhati ji, another question I kind of had for you was, I've always wondered about the name of the book, the title of the book. And I kind of found, a passage in the book. Can I get you to read another short paragraph? Is that okay?
Of course.
Yeah.
Tell me.
So this is page 22. And the part that I kind of looked at was, it begins at this part where it says, and so the technology of linga making is an ancient one. And
yes.
The paragraph kind of ends with, willingness to lay down one's life not just once, but several times over.
Yes.
Does this have any connection with the title of the book? Does it kind of speak of many things when it says more than a life?
Yes, I think there was definitely the fact that we are alluding to the many lifetimes during which this entire project of creating the Dhyanalinga was undertaken, and the many times when it seems to have failed. This is what we know and we hear of from Sadhguru himself. And so that is definitely one of the textures that one wanted in the title, that this is not just about a single lifetime, it's about more than that. But I think even more so for those who are not terribly interested in previous lifetimes, for those, I think just the portrait of a person who lives life with this level of exuberance, with this contagious joy of living, really. Just that in itself, suggesting all the things that he's involved with, all that he's excited about, all that he's curious about. Uh, just the portrait of a larger than life human being. It also was intended to be that. So, more than a life in more ways than one. Past lifetimes, if you're not allergic to the idea, certainly, and many lifetimes all in one, if you want to just focus on the person who's before you today.
Absolutely. I've always wondered how more than a life happened, and there were two ways of looking at it for me as well. Thanks for sharing about that, Akka. Akka, that also
Before
brings
you
me.
get to the next question, just to
Okay.
remind everyone in the audience, we might open up for Q&A shortly. Would you all mind putting up any questions you have in the bio so that I can go through the questions and pull you up to ask the questions? Thank you.
Yes. So my question was, I did briefly when we were conversing last week. You did briefly mention that people do still write to you about the book after 10 years or
Yes.
more than a decade. Uh,
Yeah.
are there some sharings among those that has really touched you? Would you like to share anything uh, from those sharings with us, Akka?
I think what I find very humbling about some of these emails is their vulnerability, Pavan. And what always it takes me aback is the fact that, as I said, even a decade afterwards, there are still mails that come in about people who seem to have undergone transformations of some kind, and most importantly, those who say that they hadn't really um, had much access. They didn't know much about Sadhguru. This was particularly earlier, this kind of mail, because now, of course, there's much more of Sadhguru available on social media, online, YouTube, all of that. But at that time, at the time when the book came out, which was 2010, I've had several mails from people who said they read the book and then felt this unreasonable desire to just hop on a plane right away and get to the Dhyanalinga
Right.
somehow.
Yeah. Hmm.
So that's also because the book, the plot of the book, if you will, is the life story of Sadhguru, but it's also the story of the creation of the Dhyanalinga. That becomes the central journey of the book as well, because that was his life mission. And I think there were many who wrote saying that they rushed to see, that they picked, booked tickets and just came to the ashram based on having encountered Sadhguru in that book. So that for me has been perhaps the most moving. There have been responses from those who are already within Isha, but I think it's those who come from outside, those who are drawn within because of this, that have been particularly moving for me, because in many ways that was the audience for whom this book was intended. This book was intended to, at the time that it was written, there was not very much there was not certainly this much of that was known about Sadhguru. So there was a spirit of advocacy in a way in the telling of that story. It felt like this is a story worth hearing. Here is an untold story. Come and listen to it. That was the spirit of the book.
Fantastic.
And
And I definitely know a lot of people, who personally I know that went to the ashram based on that experience. Akka, please carry on. You were just adding on.
yes, no, I think yes, I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say, Pavan, that it was, and it was, the book was intended to be an invitation, and it was also intended in some way to invite those who might be resistant and allergic to the notion of gurus.
Right.
There are many of those. There are many of those. And I myself certainly was someone who never really thought of myself as someone who would be, as I say, the very first line of the book is, I thought gurus happen to other people.
Absolutely.
That is
Yeah.
the first line of the book, because
Yes.
I never thought that this would happen to me, and I knew that there were many out there who would have shared that feeling.
Right.
And I wanted the book in some way to suggest that a guru can happen, and a guru does not have to be some sort of medieval, hierarchical figure. It is not some kind of some divide between the leader and the led. That is not the
Right.
kind of relationship that the guru disciple relationship is. it is a different kind of relationship. And I knew that there were many kinds of people with questions that could actually have been addressed had they taken to a spiritual practice. Because the spiritual practice is actually a key. Going back to your earlier question, I think one of you asked about, I would say the spiritual practice is a key. So if one is in some way uncomfortable with the notion of even a guru, once you have a practice, it becomes your way of being with yourself. It is your way of unlocking yourself. And so it is, in fact, a part of growing responsibility. It is a part of growing agency. It's a part of empowerment. It's not a part of dependence. And I think this seeing it as a part of dependence is perhaps the reason why there are some people who are, in fact, skeptical or suspicious, even worse, suspicious of the guru-disciple relationship.
Another follow-up question. Somewhere, before we go on to the audience question, somewhere you do mention that I still have a problem. I'm not using the right words. Calling him Sadhguru. Where did, what do you have to say about that? Where does that come from? Is that related? Is that something?
Yes, that's in the introduction to More Than a Life, isn't it?
Right, yes.
I think, yes. I've certainly, for a long while, I wouldn't call him anything because I wasn't sure what he represented to me in my life. There was a sense of he was a guide, but did I want it to be a word that was just, ceremonial nomenclature? Was it more than that? He was definitely already more than that. So suddenly just, calling someone your holiness or something, you can do when there is when it's just ceremonial and it's a token thing. Here, it had gone beyond token naming, but at the same time, I wasn't sure what was happening and really what the word that made the most sense to me. So for a long time, I wouldn't call him anything at all when I addressed him. But I think that has certainly changed, and I'm very comfortable with Sadhguru now, and I don't feel awkward about it. But I'm glad that paragraph is there in the book because I know there are people who would be uncomfortable and who won't know whether, what do I call this person? He's not my guru yet, so what is he? These questions come up for people. And I think, the word is a useful term, and I think I say that in the book, don't I?
Yes, you do.
I don't know if you know which paragraph that is. If you can point it to me, I'll read it to you.
So on page 11.
Page 11,
page 11. Yes, I say I still have trouble calling him Sadhguru. Ceremonial nomenclature makes me uncomfortable, but there's no doubt in my mind that he is a guru. And what's more, the word doesn't bother me quite so much anymore. It feels like like it is no more than a description, albeit an inadequate one, of a certain kind of person. A person who has a profound understanding of the workings of the inner life and knows how and when to make responsible surgical interventions in the inner lives of others as well. This knowledge is not theoretical, and Sadhguru has no qualms about admitting that he is a spiritually uneducated master who's read none of the seminal texts on yoga in their entirety. He needs no textual verification of his insights. His own inner experience, he says, has never failed him.
Wow. Thanks for firstly reading that out, but that gives more perspective right now, Akka. I do have some more questions coming up, but we have invited some of our audience to ask a question. Partha, I would like to take it.
Swami, would you like to unmute yourself and go ahead?
Swami Siragna, you're on mute if you're talking. Should we come back to Swami when he's available? Meanwhile, Kush, would you like to go?
Yeah, before Kush begins, Arundhathi ji, Kush is the person whom we'd mentioned who'd started Isha Stories last year, and we kind of picked on from him to start this. Just wanted to give you
okay.
Namaskaram, everybody. Namaskaram, Arundhathi Akka.
Namaskaram.
I wanted to start off by thanking you for writing such a wonderful book. It's really had such an profound impact on me and my spiritual path. I've come across, a few gurus, a few masters, starting from Gautam Buddha in my teenage years. I think that's what sort of triggered my journey.
Yes.
And I really wish I could put how I feel about this book into words, but I'm sorry I can't. It's just really, really had a deep impact on me. And, you know, funny story is I picked up this book the first time I went to the Isha Yoga Center in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, every time I picked up the book to read it, I could never get past the first 40 or 50 pages. Despite the fact I was so interested in it, so pulled into it, something within me just said, now is not the time. Then exactly, I would say about 5 years later, this past March, right after Mahashivratri actually, all of a sudden something within me said, now is the time. And I picked it up, and I would say I finished it maybe like in 2 days, 2 max 3 days. All I will say is it's been no less than a Isha program, and I started my journey with Isha in 2013 with inner engineering. So, you know, being involved with the foundation, watching Sadhguru's videos, reading his other books, doing programs, and volunteering, this book actually gave me a lot of information and a lot of details about his life that I didn't know before. With that being said, what I wanted to ask you here today is, so much has happened in Sadhguru's life since you published this book,
Yes.
and much awaits us in his upcoming years.
Yes.
If you were given a choice to write another enriching book on Sadhguru, what would it be about?
Thank you, Kush. First, thank you for starting this particular group. It's clearly enriched the lives of many. And a very deep gratitude. I just want to express that for what you said about the book. It helps a great deal to hear. I want you to know that really the writing of a book is a very lonely journey, and one can lose faith many times in the writing of it. So one is the whole relationship with the guru, which we've been talking about, but the other is the actual relationship with your computer, which is a lonely one, and a very, sometimes it can seem like a barren one. So it helps a great deal to hear your words. Thank you. Thank you for that. I would say that, as I mentioned, the difference between the impetus that went into the book then and now, there is a substantial difference. At that time, Sadhguru, as I said, was much less known. The entire electronic digital world had not taken on, he's now so well known. There are many who access him and discover him on those formats. At that time, it was much less so. And so there was the spirit of wanting to make this known. This story must be told. That was the spirit of the book. If there were to be a book today, you're absolutely right, much has happened in his life since. There have been innumerable projects, right? Educational and environmental, and it goes on and on. It's difficult to even keep track of them. So all of that is part of it. But I would say personally, if you were to ask me this personally, I'd say it would have to be something that people don't necessarily know enough about, which just the YouTube video does not give them access to. And perhaps you and I and all of us should think of what that might be. I think the inner life, for me personally, the inner life of a mystic is always fascinating. It is an unimaginably eventful inner life. And how the world is viewed, how time is viewed, how all of this is looked at, that perspective, I think, is something that has fascinated me earlier and continues to fascinate me. So if we were able to get Sadhguru to talk much more about those aspects in short, what we would call the more esoteric aspects of his life, I would be particularly interested. The rest of it, I think there are newspaper articles, media clippings telling you a lot about what he's doing. But that to me is the external part of it, I did a book recently, Kush, called Women Who Wear Only Themselves. And it's conversations with 4 women on spiritual journeys. We can talk about that later if there's time. That's not what what I want to implicate here. What I wanted to say is that one of the journeys is about a monk in the Isha ashram. And one of the aspects of her journey that stayed with me is the fact that for her, it is the presence of the guru rather than the person that has been so significant and so so absolutely life-changing. It is the most, it is the guiding principle in her life. And I think that is how it is for many disciples, that it is not the external aspects of what their guru is doing or saying alone that counts. In fact, much less so as the journey deepens. It is much more the inner guidance that is awakened within that is significant. So I think I'm interested much more now in that inner part of Sadhguru's life, and if he's able to give the time to talk more about it, perhaps something could come out of it. But I don't know, Kush.
Thank you so much for that answer. I agree on, especially with the point that, we, through the media and social media, we learn so much about his projects and all that he's involved in.
Yes.
But there's so much going on the inside. I'm not even talking about like behind the scenes at the ashram, because once I started volunteering, I realized there is a lot of behind the scenes work. But in the context of the mystical and the esoteric stuff, whether it be consecrations or, initiations and all that stuff. So I would also love to learn more about that.
Yes, I'm glad to hear that. And particularly, Kush, for me, it's also Devi. He's done the Devi consecrations. And maybe that could be a possible way to talk about, maybe a book about that. I don't know. We'll have to see where it goes.
A book on consecrations and especially Devi is something a lot of us will look forward to.
Yes,
Sure.
yes. Perhaps that's something to think about.
Yeah. Thank you, Kush. Thanks for your question, and thanks, Akka. Next, I think we have Shubhangi.
Shall we just check with Swami again, Pawan, before going to Shubhangi?
Oh, yes. Swami, are you there? Are you back? Can you hear us? You might have to unmute yourself, Swami. Okay. Okay, we'll still wait, Swami. If in case you can hear us, we'll wait for you to ask a question.
I think we can go ahead with Shubhangi. We'll get back to you.
Yeah. Okay, Shubhangi, please unmute yourself and go ahead with you.
Yes, thank you, Pawan. Namaskaram, everyone. Namaskaram, Arundhathi.
Namaskaram.
So first of all, it's a treat, reading what you have written. But today I realize it's a treat listening to you as well. I mean, the way you speak, it's beautiful. And thank you for whatever you have shared till now in this clubhouse. My question is, as somebody who likes to write and share about my spiritual journey, and also having experienced a certain transformation along, how do I, when I write about it, how do I share it in a relatable manner without sounding like a blind devotee, or what people refer to, the way they refer to bhakts, or being aware that the subjectivity of the subject, this journey, and the relationship that we refer to as master-disciple, how do I present it in a relatable manner?
It's such a lovely question. Thanks for that question, Shubhangi, and thanks for your response. It is not an easy subject to even talk about, so I'm glad that this conversation itself has resonated in some way with you. I'd say, Shubhangi, that one of the main things for a writer, any writer, whatever you're writing about, whether it's Sadhguru or whether you're writing about, you want to sit and write a poem about the ice cream you had yesterday, whatever the subject, the main thing to do is to be very, very alert to language itself, that you don't fall back or try not to fall back on ready-made language. I'm using the word ready-made in inverted commas, by which I mean not just the language that is already easily available out there. So, for instance, if you're writing about any subject, watch yourself and the phrases you're using. Is it coming very easily from the kind of journalistic language that you're reading on a daily basis? Is it coming very easily from the kind of notion you have about how sacred literature must be written? For instance, many people speak of lotus feet and so on. There is nothing wrong with lotus feet. In fact, that's a very beautiful image that has been used to speak of the Guru. But when you are trying to also write something that reaches out to people, it's a good idea to be very alert to the language of cliché. You want whatever it is, whether it is that everyone has tasted an ice cream, but you want that ice cream. Let's go back to the ice cream and stay away from sacred literature for a while. If you want the taste of that ice cream in some way to come alive for your reader, what would you do? That's the question you have to ask yourself. So one part of it is self-expression, of course, and that must be there. But even if you were to want to look back on that experience, how do you make it alive? How do you create that flavor, that shock of cold, of, that explosion on your tongue? How do you make that come alive? So you look for language that in some way will allow that to happen. And often, Shubhangi, the language of image comes closer than the language of just abstract nouns. So rather than use cliche and rather than use abstract nouns, if you find ways of making your language intensely concrete, it communicates to someone. The feeling might actually be communicated. I think the only thing really to remember is that. The fact that you are trying to convey to someone the sense of what it was actually like to be there. That's what you're trying to convey. So I'd say that's it really. Look out for ready-made language, beware of the cliche, and make sure you're constantly being true to the reality of your experience. That's what counts.
Thank you so much, Akka. I mean, this is really insightful, and I think till now, how I have been writing was probably not in a very alert manner, but in sort of in a rush to express. But that rush to express is something that many people may have, expressed many things which would anyway have been written already, but writing with that alertness and looking out for those cliche terms or phrases and be trying to put it in some another way. That is something that I would definitely look forward to and inculcate in my writing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shubhangi. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Shubhangi, for the question. Next, we have Mahati. Mahati, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
And namaskar, Arundhathi, and thank you so much for being here today and giving us the sort of opportunity to ask you a question. So my question is around the book that you just very briefly mentioned, Women Who Were Me Themselves. So I was reading this a few weeks ago, and I think the name of the book itself is so powerful, and even more are the journeys of the four women you have chosen to write about. So I think just knowing of their existence was very empowering for me. So I really would love to hear you speak about what inspired you to write this, and especially select these four women that you have.
Thank you, Mahati, for that question, because what you said about just learning of their existence was empowering. That was precisely the motivation for this book. I have spent so many years, Mahati, as a seeker, and I have devoured spiritual literature of all kinds. I have, as I say in the introduction to that book, I've read Ramakrishna Paramahansa. I've read, especially those who wrote about Arthur Osborne on Ramana Maharishi, Mahendranath Gupta on Ramakrishna Paramahansa, Hemad Pant on Shirdi Sai Baba. There have been so many rich and wonderful books, or even Maurice Friedman's translations of Nisargadatta Maharaj. These books have given me the kind of anchor and solace over years and years that I have desperately needed. But one of the things that has begun to strike me in the past few years is the fact that there was a deep thirst to hear women's stories. I wanted to hear the voices of women travelers on sacred journeys. That was for me a growing need. And that made me start listening much more, tuning in much more to the voices of women mystics down the centuries. But it also made me want to say, here are some wonderful women, contemporary women with whom I've had conversations over the past decade, whom I think I have been deeply enriched by, and I would like to share that enrichment with some readers. So I think just the four absolutely diverse figures that ended up being part of this book and with whom I'd had conversations, that became the basis of this I had never conceived of it as a book, but that became the basis of this book. I just thought of them as independent conversations that had nourished me. But then I started looking back on them, especially as I read the transcripts, and I said, here are these 4 extraordinary human beings that I have met. One is this naked woman mystic who wears her body with this kind of breathtaking vulnerability and courage. One is this woman who is deeply attuned to Nada Yoga, who talks with this really disarming candor about the beginnings of her life when she was a child guru and how she then reclaimed herself as a spiritual traveler. She's still a guide to many, but much more on her own terms, and she speaks of Nada Yoga and what it means to her. Then there is this wonderful account by a contemplative writer, a Marxist, and who turned into a mystic because she had this catastrophic spiritual initiation when she had an accident that catapulted her into the spiritual life. And there is the story of a monk, a contemporary monk who happens to be from Isha, a monk who speaks of how she was also catapulted from marriage to monkhood, and who sees monkhood not as some kind of feudal choice, some kind of outdated choice, but as one that is deeply relevant and contemporary, and who reminds us of what it really is, that it is not just surrender, it's not just about blind faith and surrender, it is about a deep, considered inner commitment. To me, these were just extraordinary people, and they were just waiting in some way to be released to the printed page. That's how I saw it. So that's how the book happened, Mahati.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering that. I think what really made this book special was that they were contemporary women living in the same times that we do, and that I think was sort of a little extraordinary for me to read about because some parts of it really seem unreal. So thanks for putting the account together.
Thank you. Thank you.
Arundhati ji, just to carry on with the topic of your latest book, I just wanted to see if I could somehow connect it back to your, the biography of Sadhguru, where there's a small part where you speak about Sadhguru's great grandmother. And, when I read that, it kind of, and I was reading it just to refresh my memory, it felt like, at least with the title of the book, I haven't read your latest book, she seemed like, one of those women who wore only herself.
Yes, indeed, absolutely. Do you know where that was? I think if I could find that section, I might.
Page 49.
49? Yes, he has that. I mean, I'm sure many of you have heard that account because he's talked about it so many times. But it's good to just revisit that if I can find it. Yes. There was one person in the family from whom Jaggi seemed to have inherited his wild and willful ways. Family holidays were often spent in the home of his maternal great-grandmother. Regarded as a devil of a woman, she was the original family rebel, a woman who flouted the convention of her day with impunity. Her wealthy husband owned acres of land, but she, perversely, chose to build a small temple on someone else's property. She believed no one could own land, says Sadhguru. There is a Telugu saying that the only piece of land that rightfully belongs to you is 6 by 3, the space you occupy when you're buried. Her behavior was a considerable source of embarrassment to the family, but she remained blithely unconcerned. She was the family's disgrace, a thorn in everybody's flesh, he says. You could not ignore or forget her, because people gathered around her. At least if people forgot her, if she had gone away, we could have said that she'd died. But she was right there, and she ran a kingdom of her own. I just love that, isn't it? I love the way he says, if she'd gone away, it would have been easier. And that's so true, isn't it? I mean, to go back to what Mahati was saying, the fact that these are contemporary women, to me, is part of what makes it so exciting. Because it's easy to talk, I realize, about women and men, extraordinary people dead and gone. But it is much more, I think, provoking, much more inconvenient sometimes when they're alive.
That's so true. I remember my maternal grandfather, almost a year before he passed away, he was trying to do some work for his father's, legacy and things like that. And he would come home frustrated and say, in India, nobody will give you value until you die. And it kind of stuck with me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. I think that is true. I mean, I think most of us, as I say it even in the introduction to More Than a Life, that most of us prefer our gurus dead and buried because it's much more convenient that way. You know, there's much less interrogation of our own lives when it's that way. But once you have a living guru, it is a great blessing because, in fact, that interrogation is there all the time. But at the same time, you know, if you aren't quite ready for it, and not all of us are ready for it all the time, even when we have a guru, it can be disconcerting. So, yes, indeed.
Thank you. Thank you for reading that passage. Pragyansh, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Namaskaram Akka.
Namaskaram, Pragyansh.
After reading this book, I went to places which were evident of the Sadhguru's past life, and there are overwhelming experience you like get. So how do you articulate that by writing first? And second is in the book when you wrote the story about the Bilwa that he loved a girl and he was killed by the girl's family. Okay, so that story ends with Bilwa dying, but it left you what happened to the girl. So I don't know if Sadhguru told you or it was written or not. Uh, so I want it left me with inquisity to know that what happened to the girl. As a love story, it left me like that to want to know what happened. Yes. So that was my two questions, Akka.
Yes, I mean, I'm sorry. Your first question is, what about the overwhelming experiences that one has in these places?
Yes, and
Was that your first question?
yes, and how do you explain it to others in some sense that makes logical sense?
You know, Pragyansh, I I pick my explanations to other people because there are some things that are explicable, there are others that are not, and I don't have a language for them, so I actually try to shut up about them. Sometimes I've found almost spontaneously the need to share an experience with someone, and I trust that hunch. But at other times, I've actually preferred to be quiet because I don't think, you know, eventually it's not just about trading the experience. What we're actually trying to communicate to someone is the significance of the path itself. So frequently, I might say something to someone about the path I'm on, but I may not necessarily discuss my own personal experience beyond a point because that can sometimes just end up being. You know, my experience is bigger than yours, kind of that kind of conversation, which is really pointless and counterproductive. Do you know what I'm saying? So I agree with you about, you know, for you, you've had some enormous experiences in certain places. For others, it's been perhaps at a program, for someone else at an event. I don't know. But how do you find words for it? I'd say simply, it's some way to acknowledge that when something really big happens to you, it also in some subtle way changes the person you are. That doesn't necessarily have to be, you don't go around necessarily having to tell people day before yesterday, this is what happened to me, but it will be evident in the person that you are. I, I have just found over time that that's the simpler way for me to allow an experience to communicate itself. So that in my way is a possible strategy because you don't discount your own experience, nor do you run the risk of someone else simply jeering at it or just looking at you with incomprehension. It's all right to simply allow that experience to percolate. And if there is some subtle but enduring change, the people who meet you will be aware of it.
Wow, that's beautiful.
Thanks.
And the second part of his question I've forgotten.
Pragyan, would you like to just ask the second part?
Oh, about the love story.
Love story.
I know, Pragyan. I think my answer to that would be Sadhguru has to be the one to answer this. But let me also say that the book is not just about offering, you know, it's about offering enough of a story to tantalize rather than offering you, a full-fledged. The point of the book was not the love story, so I suppose that's the reason why certain things are left unsaid. That's clearly the way Sadhguru wanted it. But also, I would say, just as a writer, independent of Sadhguru, that what would it really help us to know if it's a tragic love story or a happy one? That did she find someone else? That sort of thing, do you mean? Because that might satisfy our curiosity about plot, but it wouldn't really satisfy much else, right? I don't think any answer would be completely satisfactory there. So the whole point of that story is to point to something. I often say this, I say this in my most recent book, Women Who Were Only Themselves, that yes, these are the stories, these are conversations with women, but the point of those conversations is to point somewhere. You don't just rest content with the story itself. So I say that, and I'm just going to read that paragraph if I can find it. It's the last paragraph of the book. I say that this is how I see these women, not as case histories to be proved or disproved, but as weaves of sun and shade, of semantics and silence, somewhere between logic and lyric. And I think that suspension between logic and lyric is what you're trying to aspire to when you write something, You want enough logic for the person to stop and listen, and you want enough lyric for the person to say, oh, okay, some things would be left unsaid, and it's for my imagination or my inner life to fill in the blanks.
Beautifully said, Akka. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pragyans. Arundhati ji, Swami is back. We'll let him ask his question or whatever he wants to.
Namaskaram, Arundhati. Wonderful to hear you here.
Namaskaram, Swami. Namaskaram.
Yeah. So, am I audible?
Yes, Swami.
I think so, Swami.
Yes, you are.
So, this is the first time I'm hearing you talk about the book, and it's so wonderful to, listen to you. So I could still remember the day when you did the holders program in the ashram, and
I know, Swami. I remember many things about Swami as well, which I will divulge shortly. Huh?
Yes, please.
So it has always been intriguing that from the the person Arundhati I met during the program, from that to now, what a big journey for you. And I'm not very good at articulating like you. I wish I had that ability to articulate, but you were when you did the program, we were having a lot of questions. I could really observe from the way you asked a few questions and all those things. From there to what a journey it has been for you. So I have a lot of other questions also, but first I would like to hear from you. I know you talk to Sadhguru, and many people see you that you are talking to him like a friend, and in a very casual way. So I would like to hear from you the experience of a guru.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just share any memorable moments where you experienced him as a guru? Anything that, any anecdote or any striking whatever? Would you like to share something on that?
Yes, sure. There are many, Swami, and I touch on some of them in the book, but I'd say that, my life choices since I met him in 2004, the choices that I've made have in so many ways been governed by his presence in my life. To me, those are what I was telling Pragyansh earlier, that some of those experiences are really reflected in the person that you are and the decisions that you're making and who you are really, all of that. So I think my life choices have been evident in that. But there are a couple of episodes that I think I mentioned in the book. If we are looking for anecdote, I would say that there have been several instances in my life when these have been liminal situations, moments of great extremity, when I felt deeply conflicted about something, or else really deeply disturbed, deeply and very, very disruptive phases in my life. in those phases, he has been present in extraordinary ways, sometimes actually physically or verbally present, and in many ways, many, very, very, very often, not verbally, but otherwise. So, one of the examples, for instance, is I still remember the day that I think this happened around 2009. And I was very uncertain, very upset about something, and I spent the whole night awake in my flat in Bombay. And I was awake, and suddenly I looked at the clock and I realized it was about 8 o'clock, and I went and made myself a cup of coffee. I realized the whole night had been spent awake, and I came back. I sat with that cup of coffee, and I get a call. And the call is from Sadhguru, and he says, "Why have you pulled me out of this game of golf?" That that question stays with me today as if, it was uttered now. The suddenness of it, the enormity of that moment. And I said, "How did you?" I couldn't even say, "How did you know?" But that was essentially what every part of me was asking without actually articulating it. And I remember we talked for just a few minutes. We didn't talk very long at all. I spent a minute perhaps telling him what was bothering me. He spent perhaps 3 minutes offering a possible strategy, and we hung up. But that was one of those moments when life was really, there was a kind of moment of being on edge when the hand came, when that call came through. And of course, every one of us has had stories of this kind. So many have it. So I, don't want to over talk it in terms of to make it sound like this is the most special thing. And I'm not trying to. I just mean for me at that moment, it meant everything. Another moment that meant a great deal was when I was in bed. I couldn't get out of bed. I've had a very bad back. Swami, you might remember this because I know we've discussed this at times. I had a very bad back.
Yeah.
And I was in the ashram and I wasn't able to get out of bed. I had my wonderful friend, from Samskriti at that time, Jayashri, come in and give me my meals in my room. And I couldn't get out, and I was supposed to go to Kailash on the pilgrimage. I was supposed to accompany Sadhguru on that. It was 2011. And I sent him a message at some point because he was saying, "You must come for this." And I filled out a form, but I said, form filling is not enough. I can't get out of bed. So he suggested some exercises. I did the exercises, and they allowed me to get from my room to the dining and back, to the dining area and back. And that was about it. But I would hobble along. And then I lay in bed thinking, I remember the sheer desolation of that time. I lay in bed thinking, if I cannot even get to the dining room, how am I going to negotiate a mountain? This is insane. I'm not going to be able to do it. So I sent him a message saying, I absolutely cannot make this journey. And I remember him writing back a single line. He said, leave the troublesome topmost part of yourself behind and come. So clearly he meant leave your mind behind and come. That line sort of spoke to me as almost like a direct, it came like a very direct text message to the heart, if you will. That happened on a Friday. The next Tuesday, or perhaps it was Wednesday, but just 4 or 5 days later, I was in an airport in Chennai, waiting to board a flight from Chennai to Kathmandu via Delhi. I cannot believe I undertook that journey, and what's more, I was able to complete the entire 3-week journey. I returned, and I found that my backache returned once I got back safely to my home in Chennai. But until that time, I was absolutely well. So these to me are experiences that I don't talk about very often for a simple reason, that there is much more to Sadhguru than this. Much more. And so these are almost the small experiences that one has had. There have been much bigger ones. But I think those are best exemplified in the person that one grows into. So I hope to grow into the kind of person who is the beneficiary of such an experience. And there have been many.
So how do you cope up the contradictory part? So we were talking very beautifully about the contradiction when you were, giving the introduction. So I would like to hear from you. This is the predicament that many of the modern minds, educated minds, go through, including me. So how do you I mean, I have always been wondering, for a modern educated logical mind, uh,
Mm-hmm.
the spiritual process, the element of giving into spiritual process, which is not very logical, and many things
Mm-hmm.
doesn't fit into our frame of references. So, and yet we experience something beyond. And but for many people, there is always a hesitation to even even experiment. Forget about
Yes.
trust or surrender. So
Yes.
this is a predicament that pretty much the modern minds go through, right? So I'm sure you are
Mm-hmm.
also one of those who had a journey from there to, whatever we have. So how do you really handle this contradiction? And you have also mentioned that Sadhguru, you see Sadhguru is a man of contradiction. He seemed to be contradictory, and it's definitely
Mm-hmm.
puts off many people with the logical, for many of
Mm-hmm.
us. And
Mm-hmm.
so, how do you think this is going to really, navigate? And what do you like to?
Yes.
Uh,
Yes. Thank you, Swami. I just want to say that, this touches on what I mentioned earlier, even about the way that I see bhakti. I see myself as a bhakta. The word bhakti, unfortunately, has been used and mangled and misused in so many ways. Today, it's often used by the popular press to suggest adherence to some kind of extreme right wing politics. But in fact, the word bhakti is a very spirited commitment to a path. That's how I see it. A spirited commitment would entail a whole welter of states. It would entail doubt, it would entail fear, it would entail caution, it would entail sometimes disagreement, but the commitment remains. So, as a poet, I'm often aware of the fact that in any case, my love of this form is because I try to straddle the world as a reader of poetry and as a practitioner of it. I try to straddle this world that is about head and heart all at once. It doesn't see the languages of the two are different, but they are complementary. They are not contradictory. So, what often seems superficially like a contradiction is actually deeply connected. The two are not separate. The most tangible example of that for me is the Bhakti poets, as I mentioned earlier, who are capable of raging at their gods, shaking a fist at their gods, and loving them at the same time. There is a beautiful form, poetic form in our subcontinent called the Nindastuti. The Nindastuti is a complaint. It's a poem of complaint. And it's considered to be a prayer as well. It's considered to be a sacred poem as well. The fact that you can throw a tantrum in a poem and still be a bhakta, still be a lover of your Ishtadevta, the fact that these two are not seen as contradictory is, to my mind, at the heart of it. So I'd say that even Sadhguru, I realized this at the very start when I was working on More Than a Life. At one point, I talk about the fact that I feel I'm much more attuned now to the language of the heart than before, and it feels more of a risky place to be, but I feel it's a space I'm reclaiming for myself. And I remember Sadhguru saying, no, but that's too much of a cliche, don't turn it into head to heart. And he was absolutely right, because the journey, as I understand it, is not the exclusion of the head. The journey is an integration of head and heart. The journey, as I see it, and what he seemed to be pointing me to at that time, was yes, to inhabit every part of oneself fearlessly and to acknowledge it rather than chop it off. So, not to chop off the head, but to know when one language is meant to be used over the other, to know where one kind of articulation is to be prioritized over the other. And ideally, and this is still an aspiration for me, Swami, in my poetry, to bring the two, to integrate the two, so that they seem like just one cohesive language, not like separate languages. So, it has not been for me, I think, a journey from left brain to right brain. It has not been a journey just from head to heart. It's been a journey about acknowledging both.
so, can you share some specific moments of, actually you disagree with him, or you argued, or where you couldn't really agree? Is there any such Is it possible to share certain moments?
Where I disagree, I think, let me say that for many of the books we've worked on, I've gone in hoping to have a conversation about the book, but we've ended up spending hours arguing about something else. I'd be gnashing my teeth because, there'd be a deadline. I wanted this book to be completed. We'd be talking about something else altogether. I'd come out wondering what on earth has been accomplished. And then I'd realize that in some ways, there was an ease and a lightness to the way in which the book got done. It was intense work, but it was never heavy work. And so I realized that much more happens than the verbal banter or the verbal disagreement is one layer of the interaction. There is so much more going on. So I'm content to disagree on certain things, and I continue to. But something else is going on that is much deeper. The interaction is about much more than what seems to be happening. I think all of us have perhaps experienced that, Swami, in some way or the other, and I certainly have as well.
But honestly, it's very difficult to even comprehend that one can exist this way and that way. Like one can come to
Swami,
terms with the
I
contradiction,
agree
and
with
you are.
yes, yes.
I'm
Shall I
honestly
give you
being
an
very
example?
honest with you, especially looking at you. I mean, I was quite I don't know how to express that. I couldn't, to put it simply, I couldn't believe that there is one part in you that there is huge respect and bhakti aspect. I know for sure there is other part in you that you relate to him in a different way, don't accept, and we have spoken a lot about various other stuff where where we know we have spoken that I know he will not accept this. Anyway, that's how it is, but this is my view. So I mean, it's quite intriguing and very interesting, rather, I would say, put it, that one can actually coexist like that. It's very rare, at least.
Can I say one
to
thing,
see.
Swami? If I were to offer a very tangible example, which many others might relate to, but maybe I'm not sure it would make sense to you, I would say, what about let me not even get into, I was going to say marriage, but let's not take marriage if it's not something that, but you have certainly seen enough marriages, we've seen our parents. We've seen many ways in which they agreed, many areas in which they've agreed, and we've seen many areas in which they disagreed, and they still found ways to live together. I remember my grandfather. Let's take a relationship outside of marriage, because marriage has its own other, voltage going on. But let's take a relationship with my grandfather. I often think of that. I disagreed with him constantly about many things. But the love was absolutely not in question. And the sense of belonging, the sense of feeling that I belonged deeply to that family, that was never in question. My closest friends are those with whom I feel so much at ease that I feel I'm capable of disagreeing. The person who is perhaps one of my closest friends is someone whose politics are at great variance from mine. But we have other places of contact, and the deepest place of contact is just in the fact that we are human. And there is an essential respect for and a curiosity about the world. And there is laughter. And that sharing of laughter, that sharing of disagreement, that is friendship also. That you are at ease to disagree. That for me is what makes a campfire exciting. That you're sitting around telling stories, that you're not trying to win an argument, you're telling your story. And the other person is enriched for having heard that story. And then you move on. So that's how I see friendship, all friendship. And every kind of relationship, if we were to think about it, is one kind of friendship. Where you don't necessarily agree, but you have some areas that you do agree on and some that you don't. But there is a great deal of love, respect, and joy in being together, in that moment when two lives converge.
Yeah, I agree with that. But see, when it comes to a guru, I mean, when it comes to other relationship, yes, I agree with you. But when it comes to a guru, there are certain aspects that you have to really trust, and or else you won't even be able to do the practices which has been taught to you. So therefore, so why I'm asking this is, I have, say, like 2 weeks before I was in Chennai, and I was meeting one of the media person, and he has gone through the Isha program, and I was just accidentally talking to him, and he was saying that, yeah, I did the program.
Hello?
Swami, we lost your voice, Swami. Yeah, yes.
Seems to be some connection issue, I think.
Yeah.
Is there a connection issue?
Yeah, looks like that, Akka.
Yep.
Oh, he's dropped.
Meanwhile, can we go to Abhi Arundhati ji? Is that okay?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Abhi, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Namaskaram, everyone. Namaskaram, Arundhati Akka.
Namaskaram.
So nice to have your insight in sharing about all of your incredible moments with your books, with Guru. I have a question regarding the makings of your book. For example, I'm an artist and I had to put a picture book together, and it took me 10 trials before I finally learned how to not staple over my drawings. So I want to know
how to not
put the staple over the top of my drawings or crease it. Like, even the crease in the book, you have to make sure it's perfectly aligned. So I want to know what book has been particularly very like a favorite book of yours to put together, where everything went smoothly and it was a pleasant experience to make, and what book was particularly more harder for you to make, where there was a lot of tests and trials.
That's a wonderful question. Is your name Abik or Abi?
My name is Abhirami.
Abhirami. Okay. Thanks, Abhirami. I'd say that, More Than a Life was, as I said, it was not an easy book to make, but the way it came together eventually had a certain inevitability about it. So I think that's about as much as I look for in a book when I'm done with it. It's never going to be an immaculate product, but there seems to be a certain point at which you say, if I tweak any more, this book is going to self-destruct. So if there is something else I want to say, I will have to say it in another book. This book, I have to give up, and I have to allow it to be. So there is a beautiful line by the poet Paul Valéry. He says that you never complete a poem, you just abandon it. And I think that is something that resonated and comforted me deeply, because there are times we try to create the perfect product and it really doesn't exist. You just have to do your best. You have to work with as much precision as possible. So I'm really a votary, Abhirami, of working hard at it. Craft is an important word. But at the same time, there's a point at which you have to allow the book or allow the poem or perhaps allow your artwork to be, and you have to go and try to do better the next time. Perhaps that's what I try to do, and of course sometimes one succeeds and sometimes one fails. Which is the book that for me had that sense? I'd say More Than a Life had that sense of this is about as much as I can do for this book, and I feel even today when I look at bits of it, I feel okay, it holds. I don't feel the need to go back and change and tweak. And similarly, I would say for my book of Bhakti poetry, Eating God, there is a certain way in which it fell together, it came into place, and I don't want to change that. I feel there's an introduction to that book which sums up my views on Bhakti, given what I was just discussing earlier with Pavan and also with Swami Suyadnya. And that's very much there in the introduction, and I feel there's nothing really that I want to add to that. So I suppose those are moments when you feel, and I felt it with some of my poetry, perhaps with When God is a Traveler, this book of poems. There's a book called Love Without a Story, which is my most recent book. I feel these are poems I can't change. I'd rather now go and write something else if I feel the need to. But I don't want to go back and mess around with these again. Does that answer your question, Abhirami?
Yes, Akka, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abhi. Okay, we'll go to the next question. Jui, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Namaskaram, Arundhati Akka. It's wonderful to have you. I was so curious about this one aspect because I was in one of the sessions with Sadhguru, and he said that no matter who it is in his life,
he keeps a certain distance from just about everybody. So when you were writing the book, how did you get into that closeness, that space with him? Did being a poet like him make it available to get to a space with him in that way where he can communicate with you and then you can go ahead and write what you needed to write? And second question, when I was listening to Vaisak Sabu's interview with you, when you spoke of Baby, it just melted my heart because Baby is so close to me. So if you wanted to talk a little bit about Baby for people who don't know her, it would be such a wonderful thing to hear you talk about her. Thank you.
Thank you. About the making of More Than a Life, I will just say that certainly there has been an ease to the interactions I've had with Sadhguru. That's definitely been part of it. But about not knowing the person, I certainly don't believe that in any way that this is a definitive biography. This is one take on Sadhguru. That's the way I always approached it, and that's the way I would see the book even today. Sadhguru, as we know, can speak for himself and he can represent himself, and therefore we have so much of him available, not just in books, but online. People have their own personal access to Sadhguru on YouTube, and there are innumerable videos today. And that's a wonderful thing, and that should continue. He's a living guru, and there are many ways in which his story can be told by him and by others. So I think I was aware of that, at the start of this book, that it was going to be one provisional take on this person. And if I were to say this, I'd say this is probably true of all of us, isn't it? I'm sorry, what is the name? What is your name?
My name is Juhi.
Juhi?
No, it's Juhi. It's okay, just Juhi. Like Juhi, but it's Juhi.
Okay, Juhi. Okay, so Juhi, I'm sure this is true of every one of us. Sadhguru certainly, as a mystic with a very, very complex internal inner life, certainly. But it's also true of every one of us, really, that one friend who chooses to write our story will have one particular take. She or he may do as good a job as possible, try to offer many points of view, but it's essentially still one book. There's room for many books on each one of us if we wanted to write them. So there is no definitive take on Sadhguru, is what I wanted to say, really. And my book never, aspired to be anything definitive. That's the first thing I would say. But yes, the ease of interaction definitely helped the making of the book. Certainly. That allowed for it. And that's the first answer. The second answer about Devi, that requires, I hope, a whole clubhouse unto itself at some point. I hope we'll all meet to talk about it.
Absolutely. I would love to have that with you.
Yes. I just know that the whole texture of the ashram experience for me was altered when I encountered Linga Bhairavi, when I first entered that shrine.
Wow.
I entered it a couple of days after the consecration was done. I didn't make it for the consecration. I went that weekend. And thanks to, I think, Market Puri or Market Puri, who said, you must come, and I did. I went there, and the first thing I realized, other than just the beauty of the place, is the fact that I didn't need any instructions on how Devi was meant to be approached. I didn't want, and I actually bristle a bit when people try to tell me what I must do around her and to her. There seemed to be the greatest possible ease in that relationship. Maybe this has to do with the fact that we've had, for me, I've had, women figures in my life with whom I've had glorious relationships, starting with my mother, my grandmother, and maybe that's part of it. But the combination of ease that I felt with her, as well as the sense of this is the Divine Mother, but it's also someone whom you recognize under the skin, almost as an extension of yourself. You are a part of this.
Yes.
You are an extension of this. The deep sense of kinship. This is, of course, I'm allowing the poet in me to take over. When I talk to more logical people, I usually point out what Sadhguru often does, which is that it is a form with 3.5 chakras operating optimally and so on. If people prefer a less anthropomorphic approach, that's fine with me. But for me, the license to look at her as a Divine Mother and as a friend, and then as the deepest part of me. This makes me very joyous. This makes complete sense to me.
Yes.
That's a short answer.
It's such a beautifully put answer. Thank you so much for sharing. And lately, I feel like I don't know where she begins and when I end. And it's just such a beautiful relationship. And thank you for sharing that, because it made me also feel close to you. And I'm deeply grateful that you came onto Clubhouse to make this happen. So, with a lot of gratitude, thank you and namaste.
Namaskaram, Juhi.
Thank you, Juhi. Lakshmi, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes. Namaskaram, everyone. Namaskaram, Arundhathi Akka.
Namaskaram.
I've been hearing. So, I had the fortune to listen to both you and Sadhguru at the Bangalore Poetry Festival 2 years ago. So, as someone who writes poetry myself, I'm always in awe of someone who finds expression in poetry, something that has touched so deeply within themselves. Okay. And to somebody like you who writes exceptional poetry and prose, my question is, how do you relate to it? I know I heard you say a lot about, it's about knowing what language is to be used when, and your goal is to integrate the two. But what is that, you find yourself going back to more often? Can you speak a little bit?
You mean in terms of themes, or do you mean in terms of how I approach the act of writing poetry?
In terms of expressing something that happens internally.
How do I do it? I mean, what is my approach to that? Is that what you mean?
What is something that you find yourself going back to more easily? Is it prose? Is it poetry?
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Okay. Well, I'd say that I enjoy prose. I'm sorry, is your name Lakshmi?
Yes, Lakshmi.
Lakshmi, yeah. So Lakshmi, I'd say I enjoy prose. I love the idea. I like the lucidity and there's a kind of something dependable, for want of a better word, about prose, because you can actually see an argument develop. You can see where there's a leap from one paragraph to the other. I like, though it doesn't always have to be that way, I do like the linearity of prose. But if I were to say what form gives me the greatest joy, it would be poetry. Because for me, poetry, I've often felt, is like the shortest, it's the most direct, and it is also the most pleasurable verbal route to myself that I know, and to the world that I know. So it's that combination of directness, the ability to vault over, to not have to you don't have to join all the dots. You can actually leap from one place to the other. I often say it's the way a dancer does, I remember my earliest recollections of watching dance on stage. You see a dancer at one corner of the stage and the next moment she's in another. That's how she's the capability of leaping from one place to the other without you even knowing how she got there. In language, that is what poetry is. It is verbal dance. And that gives me a particular kind of delight, I think, that is unique.
Beautiful. Yeah. Thank you so much, Akka.
Thank you, Lakshmi. And all the best with your poetry.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Lakshmi, for your question. Next question, we have Prashant.
Also, Pawan, shall Arundhati ji, is it okay to keep this down to the last two questions?
Yes, I think so. Yes, please. Yeah.
Prashant, please go ahead, unmute yourself.
Namaskaram, Arundhati Akka. Namaskaram, everyone.
Namaskaram.
Akka, it was such a delight to listen to you. And I have always enjoyed your way of expression and the sort of ring to your voice. So my question was, you briefly mentioned about this dark night of the soul. Can that happen to you even after you have sort of been on the path for many years and you trust your guru completely? Have you experienced this? Have you had a chance to ask Sadhguru about this? Because I almost envy you for your, closeness and your friendship with the physical Sadhguru. So yeah, if you had the chance.
That's such a good question, Prashant. I'd say that, I'm not clear, I'm speaking here as a fellow sadhaka like you. And I'd say that I've definitely experienced great, very, very difficult times, even after Sadhguru came into my life. It's not like life became, was just an easy ride after that. It was not that way. There have been difficult moments. But I'm not sure I would personally describe it as a dark night of the soul, because I always felt, and I think I talk about this in my poetry, I call it a kind of dark ecstasy. There were times when things seemed to be falling away, and there was a bewilderment about it, and a terror even, and a fear, and sometimes there was rage. But there was also, alongside that, there was this kind of, there was, for want of a better word, really, a kind of rapture. Assurance also. For a while, there was actually a great joy, a kind of rapture, really, at having found that at least beneath all this was anchorage. That anchorage itself gave one a great joy as well as assurance. But let's take a different example, if we may, which is not my story. And I'm taking the liberty of mentioning it only because it's in a book that I've just written. I wouldn't otherwise mention anyone else's story, but it's in a book, and it's the book that I just mentioned earlier called Women Who Wear Only Themselves, in which one of the monks talks of her journey. And I hope you'll pick up the book sometime, Prashant, because she talks of the fact that she did in fact have a real dark night experience well after she joined the ashram. She talks with very great and very moving honesty of that dark night. And she also talks of how she came out of it and what she gained. I think the only thing I will say about dark nights, which we've been told not just by St. John of the Cross, but by so many others, is the fact that the time that seems, and this is so difficult to remember, and I have to keep telling myself this, that the time that seems the darkest is often the time of when there's a great deal of subterranean activity going on that we don't know about. Under the soil, things are shifting. And that's not apparent, and so there's a sense of barrenness and fallowness that one can experience. And this is one of the things that she talks about in her journey, in her account of her journey as well. So maybe it's something you'd like to read.
Very pragmatic, Akka, and poetic at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Prashant, for that question. We'll take the final question from Nikhil. Nikhil, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yeah. I'm completely wonderstruck. I can't believe that I'm actually speaking to you, Akka, because I enjoy writing poetry myself, and when I began, I had this huge. It might appear silly, but I had this huge, deep concern about having to divorce the poet in me if I have to be in sync with my spiritual life. But after reading your Bhakti poetry, that sort of sealed all my doubts, I would say.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad to hear that, Nikhil. Thank you.
Yeah, you play a very strong role in my spiritual journey, for very sure. And also, when I heard one of your conversations with Jane Clark and some other poet called Jane, and that also was a great. I don't know, a great inspiration for me to sort of club the both poet and the spiritual seeker within me.
Yes, and it helps me to hear that.
I have two questions for you. The first one is that how much has language shaped you as a seeker, or maybe how much has the seeker in you has shifted your approach towards language? And my second question is, do you use poetry as a tool in spiritual path? So yeah.
Well, lovely questions. I hope some of this will even address what Swami Sriyagna started asking, which is, he talked about the logical. And I must say, and I think I say this even in More Than Alive, that logic is one part of it, but as someone who's been a rasika and lover of poetry, I, I think I've always known that logic goes hand in hand with a kind of delectable illogic. And it's about knowing how to keep both alive in you. You don't have to sacrifice one at the altar of the other. You just need to know which one needs to be more active and at what time. That's all. And you know how the dancer gets from one point of the stage to the other? Sometimes you need to know every step she's taken, and the other point, you just want to sit back and say bah and nothing else and enjoy that leap. So that for me is how poetry works. Nikhil. Nikhil, have I got the name right?
Yes.
Yes. So, Nikhil, I'd say that the way in which language changed for me was this, that perhaps my earlier understanding of poetry was on the level of the delight of language, the rhythm of language, the sensual plenitude and joy of language. And of course, there was the need for self expression. So I wanted to find an image that could describe, for instance, the smell of my grandmother's puja room. I wanted an image that could give that very particular smell that only her puja room has, at least in my experience. So I was looking for that kind of precision as well. So all of that was very important to me, and it has not ceased to be important. But what the spiritual journey did bring into my life was a newfound respect for pauses, a newfound respect for silences, a newfound respect for rhythm, even realizing that rhythm was not just about what I created on the page, but that rhythm was actually about listening closely and not being in a hurry to impose a rhythm on the page or even on a poem or even on a conversation or even on a person, but allowing the silences also to do some of the talking. So I think that because I was stripped up, Nikhil, quite honestly, I was stripped up by a big silence, a big hole in my life in 97, as we discussed earlier. I think it actually created in me a newfound respect for in fact, the many holes in our lives and the many holes in language. And that in some way must have, I think, molded the texture of the poetry as well. So that's my answer to your first question. And the second one, which I think is about how can poetry be a tool? I think it can certainly be a tool. If by poetry we mean a way of discovering who we are, that whole process of trying to understand who you are verbally and knowing when the verbal stops and something else takes over, that's part of being a poet, isn't it? So I think whatever you do every day, even if it's not poetry, you may want to journal daily. Even those of us who are not poets, not writers, but those who keep a diary daily, discover this, I think, for themselves, that in the act of writing, something shifts. You start out at the start of the page, you're angry. By the time you reach the end of the page, something else has happened. That is the alchemy of writing as well, which is a wonderful alchemy. I don't think we need to dismiss the alchemy that the arts bring into our lives. We just need to be open to deeper alchemies as well. That's all. And I think a verbal art can often lead you to that point where it can begin to at least awaken a sense of wonder and awe at a new alchemy, a new possibility. That's how I end my most recent book, Women Who Wear Only Themselves. I say that all these women are speaking different languages, but essentially they're just pointing to the moon. We can get caught up with the utterance, but that's not the point. The point is to look to where those fingers are pointing, and those are fingers pointing to the moon. So look up and drink silver. That's really what we need to do.
Thank you so much. I love the way how you put being open to deeper alchemies. That made a great deal of sense to me. Thank you so much, Akka.
Thank you, Nikhil.
Thank you, Nikhil. Arundhati ji, Swami has one last question before we close.
Mm-hmm.
So, Namaskaram. So, I wanted to ask you, have you ever felt that, I know you are physically or interacting a lot with Sadhguru. Has it in any way, have you ever felt that it has come in the way of experiencing uh, the Guru aspect, or is it come as a disadvantage because you are more accessible? Is there anything like that you have? Do you want to share one thing? And second thing, second not part of the question. Second different question is, uh, do you think in this current modern life, uh, with the logical mind taking the upper hand, this aspect of mysticism, this the guru aspect, all those things. Do you see, how do you see? Do you think it is going to really strike a chord with the modern mind? Do you think more people will be able to walk this path? And how do you see being yourself being a very logical thinker and intellect yourself? So how do you see that?
Yes, Swami, those are good questions, and in some ways I like the way in which the entire conversation in many ways has circled back to these questions again and again. As I was saying to Nikhil just a moment ago, I'm certainly someone for whom the life of the mind matters, but I also see myself as a lover of poetry, which means that logic is important to me, but not just logic. There has to be more. It has to be a love of, for instance, books are important to me, but it has to be lubricated by a great passion. Otherwise, it ceases to have meaning. Let me say that this answer, to answer this first part of your question about the person of Sadhguru, whether it has come in the way, I would say it has certainly it's certainly been a negotiation for me to see that there is an overlap, but not an identicality. The two are not completely the same. The person and the presence for me are distinct. They overlap sometimes, but they're not the same. So the presence is something that for me has been something that has deepened, that understanding of what that presence might mean has deepened over the years. And so there are times, for instance, at the early start of my time with Isha, when I needed to hear a lot of what Sadhguru was saying, that has fallen away. I don't feel inclined, for instance, to necessarily watch YouTube videos or to hear what he's saying as much. I feel much more in touch with the presence. And that to me has been the deeper anchor. So for those who sometimes find themselves, there are many who are drawn to the personality, but there are also some who may have a problem. And to those who have a problem with the personality, because all of us are personalities that to some degree some people will like and some will have a problem with. So it's not just Sadhguru. Everyone is capable of the same thing. He is a guru, so he embodies it as a public figure as well on another level. I'd say to everyone that the whole point of the journey is to move away from the personality, and the journey itself takes you away from the personality towards something deeper. And you don't have to worry too much about it. It happens. So that actually brings me to the second part of your question, which is about the modern mind and how it would navigate this path. I'd say that one thing that is clear to me is that it is a path when you've been seeking a very long time and you discover your spiritual path. It is like a sense of homecoming, and there is a deep gratitude for that. And that path is your home to some degree, but it is also the beginning of another journey. And on that journey, you have, at least for me, it's been important to remember that I can trust the guidance, the inner, what is rapidly becoming an inner guidance, not just an external one. The sense of trust for that guidance is important, but equally what is important is responsibility. So it's been a path also of growing responsibility. And I think we need to remember that. And I would say this to anyone who's embarking on such a journey, that this is not just a journey of coming home and saying, oh, I'm going to drop my burdens and now become dependent on the master of the house, or on the mother of this household, or whoever. It's not about setting up another authority structure unless you want one. If you want one, then you can replicate the same authority structures you found in the outer world. You can bring it in here and continue with them. But if what you're also looking for is selfhood, a greater sense of being yourself, then it's important to remember that this is a path of responsibility, that you are exercising a choice. Each time you go a step further, you're exercising a choice. You may have some doubts, but you have allowed your discretion to decree that you will take the next step despite those doubts. And in some cases, you may say, no, I don't want to take another step further, and that's all right too. But I think only if we realize that this is a path of responsibility in which we have to take control and we have to acknowledge our own inner lives. We're not just looking outside, because outside you can find fault with the outside and you can also glorify the outside. I think it's really an invitation to move away from the impulse to hero worship. It's an invitation to move away from the impulse to denounce. We're not living in a world, I think that as you start moving inward, you realize it's not a world of heroes and villains. You stop playing the blame game, you start taking responsibility, greater responsibility for your life.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Arundhati. That was really brilliant. Thanks for your
Thank you,
answer.
Swami. Thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you, Swami. Pawan, I guess, Arundhati, that's, we'll close
I think it's time to wind up. It's been a long session, hasn't it? Thank you very much, Pawan and Partha.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for giving us your time, for indulging us, and for being so patient with us. We thoroughly enjoyed your presence here. It was delightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you to each of you and to all those who participated.
Thank you very much, Akka. Some fascinating questions, fascinating stories and sharings. Couldn't have asked for anything better than this. And thank you for staying on for longer than planned. My humblest gratitude and my deepest gratitude to you.
Thank you both. And I think there was a flow to the proceedings, and I was very glad to be part of that flow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. It was wonderful having all of you here.